Today we are going to be talking about Reservoir Dogs. The film opens with 8 men eating breakfast at a diner. 6 of them wear matching black suits and ties and are using aliases: Mr. Blonde, Mr. Blue, Mr. Brown, Mr. Orange, Mr. Pink, and Mr. White. Among them is the elderly Los Angeles gangster Joe Cabot, and his beefy son, nice guy Eddie Cabot. Mr. Brown discusses his comparative analysis on Madonna's Like a Virgin. Nice guy Eddie mentions that he's been listening to a local rock radio program called K-Billy's Super Sounds of the 70s and has been hearing songs that haven't been played in years. Joe's senior moments involving an old address book rankle Mr. White. White grabs the book away from Joe and refuses to give it back until Joe stops talking endlessly about it. When it comes time for Joe to pay the bill for the meal, he tells everyone to throw in $1 for the tip. Mr. Pink explains that he doesn't tip and defends his anti-tipping policy until Joe forces him to contribute with the group. After the opening credits, the action cuts to the interior of a speeding car. Mr. White, driving with one hand, is trying to comfort Mr. Orange lying in the back seat, who has been shot in the abdomen and is bleeding and screaming in pain. They arrive at an abandoned warehouse, the robbers' rendezvous point. Orange begs White to take him to an emergency room, but White refuses, saying that it takes a long time to die from an abdominal gunshot wound. Mr. White leaves Mr. Orange on the floor when Mr. Pink appears, angrily suggesting that their robbery of a jeweler, orchestrated by Joe Cabot, was a police setup, indicated by the rapid response of the police to the alarm. White agrees, and they wearily get their stories straight with each other. The first of several flashbacks shows Mr. Pink escaping from the jewelry store with the diamonds. While running down a street chased by 3 or 4 policemen, Mr. Pink is hit by a car, out of which he drags out the woman driver and opens fire on the policemen, hitting 1 or 2 of them before getting in the car and driving away. Back in the present, Mr. White reveals to Mr. Pink that Mr. Brown was shot and killed by the police during the getaway, and the whereabouts of Mr. Blonde and Mr. Blue are unknown to both. They agree to stay put for the time being. Mr. White. A short flashback shows Mr. White meeting with Joe Cabot and at Joe's office, where he offers Mr. White, a low-time veteran criminal from Wisconsin, a job in an upcoming heist in a few months. Mr. White agrees, hinting at White's longtime friendship with Joe Cabot. In the present, after taking care of an unconscious Orange, the 2 men discuss the actions of Mr. Blonde, who suddenly acted psychotic during the heist and murdered several civilians in the store after the alarm had been triggered. Mr. White is angered about Joe's decision to employ such a violent individual and agrees about the possibility of a setup, while Mr. Pink confesses to having hidden the diamonds in a secure location. However, they violently argue about whether or not to take the unconscious Mr. Orange to a hospital when Mr. White reveals that he had told the former his true first name, Larry. Mr. Blonde, who has been watching them from the shadows, steps forward and ends the dispute. White angrily chews out Blonde for his antics, while Blonde calmly defends himself, saying simply that he'd warned the staff of the jewelers not to touch the alarm. He tells them not to leave the rendezvous as he'd spoken to nice guy Eddie, who's on his way. After everyone calms down, Mr. Blonde takes them to his car and opens the trunk to reveal a captured police officer named Marvin Nash, who he apparently took as a hostage to escape from the jewelry store. Mr. Blonde. Another flashback shows Mr. Blonde, who meets with Joe Cabot and nice guy Eddie at their office. The meeting reveals that Mr. Blonde became involved in the heist because of his friendship with nice guy Eddie. Blonde, whose real name is Vic Vega, had served 4 years in prison for armed robbery and had refused to give the authorities Joe's name for a lighter sentence. When he meets with Joe and Eddie, they first arrange a job that will appease Vic/Blonde's parole officer, and help Vic sidestep contact with the man. Then Eddie suggests that Blonde join the crew they're putting together for the jewel heist. Blonde enthusiastically accepts. In the present, White, Pink, and Blonde beat the policeman and demand that he reveal who the rat is. He protests that he doesn't know. The beating continues until a furious Eddie arrives at the warehouse. After berating the men over the carnage and incompetence displayed at the heist, and telling them that beating Nash won't get them closer to finding out anything, he orders Pink and White to assist him in retrieving the stolen diamonds and disposal of the 2 hijacked vehicles. He orders Blonde to stay with Nash and the dying Orange. Eddie, Pink and White then leave the scene. When Blonde casually questions Officer Nash again, the policeman states that he has been a police officer for 8 months and is ignorant as to a possible setup. He then pleads with Blonde to release him without further incident. However, Blonde confesses that he really is a sadist and psychopath who enjoys torture, and he is really uninterested in what the cop knows and what he doesn't. He turns on the radio and dances to Stuck in the Middle with You by Steelers Will before slashing Officer Marvin Nash's face and severing his right ear with a straight razor. Blonde then retrieves a can of gasoline from the trunk of his stolen car, douses Officer Nash in the gasoline, making a small trail of the remaining gasoline in front of the policeman. Just as he is about to light the gasoline, he is hit by several shots. Orange had suddenly woken up and shot Blonde several times to stop him from burning Nash. With Mr. Blonde dead, Mr. Orange and Officer Nash are now alone in the warehouse. Orange reveals he is a police detective named Freddie Neuendijk. Marvin says he knows, because he briefly met him a couple of months earlier, showing us that he had resisted the beating and torture so as not to reveal Orange's true identity. Orange reassures Marvin that a massive police force is in position several blocks away but are waiting to move in when Joe arrives. Mr. Orange. Another long flashback details Orange's involvement in a deep-cover police operation to capture Joe Cabot. Mr. Orange/Freddie is shown meeting his handler Holdaway, Randy Brooks, one night at a local diner where he tells Holdaway that he is in full with the gang after meeting Joe and Nice Guy Eddie earlier that evening at a nightclub that Joe owns, as well as describing a criminal informant, down in Long Beach about planning his false criminal past as a reference to be accepted. Orange/Freddie also talks about Mr. White, whom he did not recognize as part of Joe's group. Holdaway then asks Orange/Freddie about something called the commode story, which Orange says that they bought it. Next, in further flashbacks within flashbacks, Orange/Freddie is rehearsing his cover with Holdaway as well as getting into character for his first meeting with Joe involving the commode story, rehearsing the scene like a professional actor to describe a part of his cover for his criminal past from the beaches in Venice, to his apartment, to a rooftop scene with Holdaway instructing Freddie to be on detail with the story to make it believable. Mr. Orange/Freddie first meets Joe Cabot, Eddie, and Mr. White at a local nightclub where he tells them the commode story, a fabricated story, shown in a completely fabricated flashback, about being in a men's room with a large bag full of marijuana. In the men's room with him were 4 LA County sheriffs with a German Shepherd and explained about his coolness under pressure, knowing the dog can smell the marijuana. The group is wholly amused and accepts him into their gang. Later, Orange then goes with Eddie, White, and Pink on a drive where they discuss their favorite movie soundtracks and about Pam Grier movies from the 1970s, and Eddie tells them a story about how a black waitress at one of Joe's nightclubs got even with her abusive husband, as well as how black women seem to be more abused and temper-angry than white women. Mr. Orange/Freddie mostly stays out of the conversation, somewhat offended by Eddie, White and Pink's racist talk involving African Americans, mostly since his friend and handler Holdaway is black. They are silently being tailed by unseen police detectives from Freddie's apartment to the warehouse hideaway. At the warehouse, Joe Cabot meets with all of the members of the gang where he angrily tells them that their joking camaraderie might get them in trouble if they don't take the heist seriously. He gives them their aliases to be used and to go over details about the upcoming robbery of a diamond store. A brief argument ensues when Pink complains about his name. Joe regains his control over the meeting and they begin plotting the heist. After the meeting, Orange develops a friendship with White as they drive over to the jewelry store to discuss their roles in the upcoming robbery. White tells Orange about a few methods of crowd control he knows are foolproof. In another flashback to the robbery getaway, we see that Brown was somehow shot in the head, and dies while driving their escape car with Orange and White in the back seat, which crashes into a parked car in an alleyway a short distance away from the jewelry store. Orange watches helplessly while White gets out of the car and opens fire with his 2 semi-automatic handguns on an approaching police car and violently massacring both cops in the car. With Brown now dead, White and Orange run from the scene and make it to another road. While attempting to steal another getaway car, it is revealed here that Orange was shot in the stomach by the female driver of the car he and White steal. Orange reflexively shoots and kills the woman after she shoots him. Flashing forward back to the present, Eddie, White and Pink return to the warehouse to find Blonde dead. Orange claims that Blonde was going to kill Marvin, Orange and the rest of the gang so that he could take the diamonds for himself. Boiling over with rage, Eddie briefly reveals Blonde's backstory, that he was a close friend of his and a loyal soldier of his father's. Orange struggles to defend himself, which makes Eddie even angrier, and he fatally shoots Nash 3 times. Joe himself arrives and, after informing the group that Mr. Blue was killed by the police, confidently accuses Orange of being an informant. White comes to Orange's defense, alternately appealing and debating Orange's loyalty with Joe. A Mexican standoff ensues, Joe draws on Orange, White draws on Joe and Eddie draws on White. Everyone begins shooting, leaving Joe and Eddie dead, and White severely wounded, and Orange mortally wounded. Pink, who hid to avoid the shootout, takes the cache of diamonds and flees the warehouse. As police sirens are heard outside, White cradles Orange in his arms and Orange reveals that he is in fact a detective. White is devastated and he begins sobbing in frustration and points his gun at Orange's head as police can be heard outside. At that moment, the police can be heard raiding the warehouse, With the camera in a close-up of White's face, demanding White drop his gun, he refuses and shoots Orange, resulting in the police opening fire on White just before the screen goes black. Bringing us to the end of the movie. Comment below what you think. If you haven't already, like and subscribe.